I'll start now. We are on beginning on excuse me, beginning on chapter 1. It's page 30 of the PDF text. Again, I'll repeat, I'm not sure if this is the most updated version of the book. I think this one is from 2012. So again, there's going to be a dozen years of American crimes that are not in this book. He has come out with a new edition, an updated edition every few years to try to keep up with the new editions of American crimes internationally, American military interventions and covert operations. But Mr. Blum apparently passed away in 2018, so we won't have anything to cover the American crimes of the last 6 years. But anyway, for the 2012 edition, we're starting on page 30, which is where chapter 1 begins. That's the book itself is available. I think it's a pinned message in the book discussion group, the Killing Hope book discussion group. All right, Bismillah. Chapter 1, China, 1945 to 1960s. Was Mao Zedong just paranoid? For 4 years, numerous Americans in high positions and obscure suddenly harbored the conviction that World War II was, quote, the wrong war against the wrong enemies. Communism, they knew, was the only genuine adversary on America's historical agenda. Was that not why Hitler had been ignored and tolerated and appeased and aided for all those years? So that the Nazi war machine would turn east and wipe Bolshevism off the face of the earth once and for all. It was just unfortunate that Adolf turned out to be such a megalomaniac and turned west as well. But that war was over. These Americans were now to have their day in every corner of the world, meaning these Americans who believed that communism was the main enemy. The ink on the Japanese surrender treaty was hardly dry when the United States began to use the Japanese soldiers still in China, alongside American troops, in a joint effort against the Chinese communists. In the Philippines and in Greece, as we shall see, the U.S. did not even wait for the war to end before subordinating the struggle against Japan and Germany to the anti-communist crusade. The communists in China had worked closely with the American military during the war, providing important intelligence about the Japanese occupiers, rescuing and caring for downed U.S. airmen. But no matter, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek would be Washington's man. He headed what passed for a central government in China, the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, which was the forerunner of the CIA, estimated that the bulk of Chiang's military effort had been directed against the communists rather than against the Japanese. He had also done his best to block the cooperation between the Reds and the Americans. Now his army contained Japanese units, and his regime was full of officials who had collaborated with the Japanese and served in their puppet government. But no matter. The Generalissimo was as anti-communist as they come. Moreover, he was a born American client. His forces would be properly trained and equipped to do battle with the men of Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai. I know my wife is laughing at my pronunciation here because she speaks Mandarin. President Truman was upfront about what he described as, quote, using the Japanese to hold off the communists. Here's a quote from President Truman. It was perfectly clear to us that if we told the Japanese to lay down their arms immediately and march to the seaboard, the entire country would be taken over by the communists. We therefore had to take the unusual step of using the enemy as a garrison until we could airlift Chinese national troops, Chiang Kai-shek's troops, to South China and send Marines to guard the seaports. The deployment of American Marines had swift and dramatic results. 2 weeks after the end of the war, Peking was surrounded by communist forces. Only the arrival of the Marines in the city prevented the Reds from taking it over. And while Mao's forces were pushing into Shanghai's suburbs, U.S. transport planes dropped Chiang Kai-shek's troops to seize the city. In a scramble to get to key centers and ports before the communists, the U.S. transported 400,000 and 500,000 nationalist troops by ship and by plane all over the vastness of China and Manchuria, places that they could never have reached otherwise. As the Civil War heated up, the 50,000 Marines sent by Truman were used to guard railway lines, coal mines, ports, bridges, and other strategic sites. Inevitably, they became involved in the fighting, sustaining dozens, if not hundreds, of casualties. U.S. troops, the communists charged, attacked areas controlled by the Reds, directly opened fire on them, arrested military officers, and disarmed soldiers. The Americans found themselves blasting a small Chinese village unmercifully. That was written by a Marine to his congressman, not knowing how many innocent people were slaughtered. So you have an American Marine who at the time was serving in China for the Americans to fight against Mao Zedong and the communist revolutionary, so-called communist revolutionary forces. And he's saying that the American Marines unmercifully attacked a Chinese village and don't know even how many innocent people they slaughtered. United States planes regularly made reconnaissance flights over communist territory to scout the positions of their forces. The communists claimed that American planes frequently strafed and bombed their troops, and in one instance, machine-gunned a communist-held town. To what extent these attacks were carried out by U.S. airmen is not known. There were, however, American survivors in some of the many clashes of the United States aircraft. Surprisingly, the Reds continued to rescue them, tend to their wounds, and return them to U.S. bases. It may be difficult to appreciate now, but at this time, the mystique and the myth of America still gripped the imagination of people all over the world, and Chinese peasants, whether labeled communist or not, were no exception. During the war, the Reds had helped to rescue scores of American flyers and had transported them through Japanese lines to safety. Quote unquote, the communists, wrote the New York Times, did not lose one airman taken under their protection. They made a point of never accepting rewards for saving American airmen. When 1946 arrived, about 100,000 American military personnel were still in China, still supporting Chiang Kai-shek. The official United States explanation for the presence of its military was that they were there to disarm and repatriate the Japanese. Though this task was indeed carried out eventually, it was secondary to the military's political function, as Truman's statement cited above makes abundantly clear. In other words, the Americans were saying that we're there to disarm and repatriate the Japanese who had occupied China. But in fact, the reason that they were there was to fight against Mao Zedong and the so-called communist revolutionary forces. The American soldiers in China began to protest about not being sent home. A complaint echoed around, isn't that familiar? Began to protest that they were not being sent home. A complaint echoed around the world by other GIs kept overseas for political, usually anti-communist purposes. Here they're quoting a soldier. They ask me too why they're here, said a Marine lieutenant in China at Christmas time in 1945. As an officer, I'm supposed to tell them, but you can't tell a man that he's here to disarm Japanese when he's guarding the same railway with armed Japanese. Strangely enough, the United States attempted to mediate in the Civil War, this while being an active, powerful participant on one side. In January 1946, let me just make sure that that's clear. The United States attempted to mediate in the Civil War in China, even though they were an active participant on one side of that Civil War, which is, again, something that we see time and time and time again. America is an active participant in a conflict, and then it pretends that it can act as an impartial negotiator, an impartial mediator, when it's very clear that they're taking sides. And the most obvious example of that, of course, is Israel and Palestine. President Truman, apparently recognizing that it was either compromise with the communists or see all of China fall under their sway, sent General George Marshall to try and arrange a ceasefire and some kind of unspecified coalition government. While some temporary success was achieved in an on and off truce, while some temporary success was achieved in an on and off truce, the idea of a coalition government was doomed to failure, as unlikely as a marriage between the Tsar and the Bolsheviks. As the historian D.F. Fleming has pointed out, one cannot unite a dying oligarchy with a rising revolution. That's kind of an important sentence to keep in mind as we move forward in our life. Not until early 1947 did the United States begin to withdraw some of its military forces from China, although aid and support to the Chiang Kai-shek government continued in one form or another long afterwards. At about the same time, the Flying Tigers began to operate. The legendary American Air Squadron, under the leadership of General Claire Chennault, had fought for the Chinese against the Japanese before and during the World War. Now, Chennault, Chiang's former Air Force advisor, had reactivated the squadron under the name CAT, C-A-T, and its pilots of fortune soon found themselves in the thick of the fray, flying endless supply missions to nationalist cities under siege, dodging communist shell bursts to airlift food, ammunition and supplies of all kinds, or to rescue the wounded. Technically, CAT was a private airline hired by the Chiang Kai-shek government. But before the Civil War came to an end, the airline had formally interlocked with the CIA to become the first unit in the agency's sprawling air empire to be, best known for the Air America line. By 1949, United States aid to the Nationalists by 1949, United States aid to the Nationalists since the war had amounted to almost $2 billion in cash and $1 billion worth of military hardware. 39 Nationalist Army divisions had been trained and equipped. Yet the Chiang Kai-shek dynasty was collapsing all around in bits and pieces. It had not been only the onslaught of Chiang's communist foes, but the hostility of the Chinese people to his tyranny, his wanton cruelty, and the extraordinary corruption and decadence of his entire bureaucratic and social system. By contrast, the large areas under communist administration were models of honesty, progress, and fairness. Entire divisions of the Generalissimo's forces defected to the communists. American political and military leaders had no illusions about the nature and the quality of Chiang Kai-shek's rule. The nationalist forces, said General David Burr, head of the U.S. military mission in China, were under, quote, the world's worst leadership. The Generalissimo, his cohorts and soldiers, fled to the offshore island of Taiwan. They had prepared their entry 2 years earlier by terrorizing the islanders into submission, a massacre which took the lives of as many as 28,000 people. Prior to the nationalists' escape to the island, the U.S. government entertained no doubts that Taiwan was a part of China. Afterwards, uncertainty began to creep into the minds of Washington officials. The crisis was resolved in a remarkably simple manner. The U.S. agreed with Chiang Kai-shek that the proper way to view the situation was not that Taiwan belonged to China, but that Taiwan was China. And so it was called. In the wake of the communist success. China scholar Felix Green observed, quote, Americans simply could not bring themselves to believe that the Chinese, however rotten their leadership, could have preferred a communist government. It must have been the handiwork of a conspiracy, an international conspiracy, at the control panel of which sat not unexpectedly the Soviet Union. The evidence for this, however, was thin to the point of transparency. Indeed, ever since Stalin's credo of socialism in one country won out over Trotsky's internationalism in the 1920s, the Russians had sided with Chiang Kai-shek more than with Mao, advising the latter more than once to dissolve his army and join Chiang Kai-shek's government. Particularly in the post-World War II years, when the Soviet Union was faced with its own staggering crisis of reconstruction, did it not relish the prospect of having to help lift the world's most populous nation into the modern age. In 1947, General Marshall stated publicly that he knew of no evidence that the Chinese communists were being supported by the USSR. But in the United States, this did not prevent the rise of an entire mythology of how the U.S. had, quote unquote, lost China. Soviet intervention, State Department communists, White House cowards, military and diplomatic folly, communist dupes, and fellow travelers in the media, treachery everywhere. The Truman administration said Senator Joseph McCarthy, with characteristic charm, was composed of, quote, egg-sucking phony liberals who protected the communists and queers who had sold China into atheistic slavery. I mean, was there ever a time that their politicians were not clowns? Yet, short of an all-out invasion of the country by large numbers of American troops, it's difficult to see what more the U.S. government could have done to prevent Chiang's downfall. Even after Chiang fled to Taiwan, the United States pursued a campaign of relentless assaults against the communist government, despite a request from Zhou Enlai for aid and for friendship. The Red leader saw no practical or ideological bar in this. Instead, the United States evidently conspired to assassinate Zhou on several occasions. Many nationalist soldiers had taken refuge in northern Burma in the Great Exodus of 1949, much to the displeasure of the Burmese government. Then there, the CIA began to regroup this stateless army into a fighting force. And during the early 1950s, a number of large and small-scale incursions into China were carried out. In one instance, in April 1951, a few thousand troops, accompanied by CIA advisors and supplied by airdrops from American C-46s and C-47s, crossed the border into China's Yunnan province. But they were driven back by the communists in less than a week. The casualties were high and included several CIA advisors who lost their lives. Another raid that summer took the invaders 65 miles into China, where they reportedly held a 100-mile-long strip of territory. While the attacks continued intermittently, the CIA proceeded to build up the force's capabilities. American engineers arrived to help construct and to expand airstrips in Burma. Fresh troops were flown in from Taiwan. Other troops were recruited from amongst the Burmese tribes in the hills. CIA air squadrons were brought in for logistical services, and enormous quantities of American heavy arms were ferried in. Much of the supply of men and equipment came in via nearby Thailand. The army soon stood at more than 10,000 men. By the end of 1952, Taiwan claimed that 41,000 communist troops had been killed and more than 3,000 wounded. The figures were most likely exaggerated, but even if not, it was clear that the raids would not lead to Chiang Kai-shek's triumphant return to the mainland, although this was not their sole purpose. On the Chinese border, two greater battles were raging in Korea and Vietnam. It was the hope of the United States to force the Chinese to divert troops and military resources away from these areas. The infant People's Republic of China was undergoing a terrible test. In between raids on China, the Chinats, as distinguished from the Chicoms, found time to clash frequently with Burmese troops. I don't know who that refers to, I'm afraid. Chinese nationalists and Chinese communists. I'm sorry. That's what it means. Chinats, Chinese nationalists, meaning the anti-communist forces, and the Chicoms, the communist Chinese. Found time to clash frequently with Burmese troops, indulge in banditry, and become the opium barons of the Golden Triangle. That slice of land encompassing parts of Burma, Laos, and Thailand, which was the world's largest source of opium and heroin. CIA pilots flew the stuff all over, heroin and opium, flew the stuff all over to secure the cooperation of those in Thailand who were important to the military operation as a favor to their nationalist clients, perhaps even for the money, and ironically, to serve as a cover for their more illicit activities. The Chinats, the Chinese nationalists, I don't know why you can't just say it plainly, the Chinese nationalists in Burma kept up their harassment of the Chinese communists until 1961, and the CIA continued to supply them militarily, but at some point, the agency began to phase itself out of a more direct involvement. When the CIA, in response to repeated protests by the Burmese government to the United States and the United Nations, put pressure on the Chinese nationalists to leave Burma, Chiang Kai-shek responded by threatening to expose the agency's covert support of his troops there. At an earlier stage, the CIA had entertained the hope that the Chinese would be provoked into attacking Burma, thereby forcing the strictly neutral Burmese to seek salvation in the Western camp. In January 1961, the Chinese did just that, but as part of a combined force with the Burmese to overwhelm the nationalists' main base and mark finish to their Burmese adventure. Burma subsequently renounced American aid and moved closer to Peking. For many of the Chinese nationalists, excuse me?
I was just saying that's quite remarkable that what the Burmese did as a
It is,
strategy,
especially when you consider what the Americans were trying to do.
Yeah,
the Americans.
it's really remarkable.
It is.
They were trying.
Yeah, the Americans were trying to get the Chinese to attack Burma as a whole. They were trying to get China to attack Burma as a whole. But the Burmese themselves, this is how the Americans don't understand how they're perceived and how people feel about what they're doing, because and how they don't listen. The Burmese had been telling you, we don't like these nationalists being here. It's bad for us. You're making a problem for us. So then they made common cause with China, with the communist China, to drive the nationalists out. Like your own bias and your own hubris and your own supremacism makes you incapable of understanding other people, and therefore makes you incapable of having even a proper strategy for dealing with people in a normal way, in a decent way. You're always going to be aggressive. You're always going to be hostile because you have an incapability of understanding other people and even listening to them when they tell you directly, like with the Burmese. We don't want the nationalists here. We want them out, and you don't care. Because what you think doesn't matter. What you want doesn't matter. This is what we want. For many of the Chinese for many of the Chinese nationalists, unemployment was short-lived. They soon signed up with the CIA once again, this time to fight with the agency's Grand Army in Laos. Burma was not only this is almost like it becomes like a Wagner. It becomes a kind of a private army that you have that you can now send wherever you want in the region. It just became mercenaries. Burma was not the only jumping off site for CIA-organized raids into China. Several islands within about 5 miles of the Chinese coast, particularly Kornoi and Matsu, were used as bases for hit-and-run attacks, often in battalion strength, for occasionally bombing forays and to blockade mainland ports. Chiang Kai-shek was brutally pressured by the U.S., quote-unquote, brutally pressured by the U.S. to build up his troops on the islands beginning around 1953, as a demonstration of Washington's new policy of, quote-unquote, unleashing him. You have to build him up and force him to be unleashed. The Chinese retaliated several times with heavy artillery attacks on Kornoi, on one occasion killing 2 American military officers. The prospect of an escalated war led the U.S. later to have second thoughts and to ask Chiang Kai-shek to abandon the islands, but he then refused. The suggestion has often been put forward that Chiang Kai-shek's design was to embroil the United States in just such a war as his one means of returning to the mainland. Many incursions into China were made by smaller commando-type teams airdropped in for intelligence and sabotage purposes. In November 1952, 2 CIA officers, John Downey and Richard Fecteau, who had been engaged in flying these teams in and dropping supplies to them, were shot down and captured by the communists. That's in 1952. 2 years passed by before Peking announced the capture and the sentencing of the 2 men. The State Department broke its own 2-year silence with indignation, claiming that the 2 men had been civilian employees of the State Department, of the Army, U.S. State, The State Department broke its own 2-year silence with indignation, claiming that the 2 men had been civilian employees of the U.S. Department of the Army in Japan, who were presumed lost on a flight from Korea to Japan. Quote, how they came into the hands of the Chinese communists is unknown to the United States. The continued wrongful detention of these American citizens furnishes further proof of the Chinese Communist regime's disregard for accepted practices of international conduct. I mean, subhanallah, la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. The hypocrisy is just breathtaking. It's absolutely breathtaking. Fecteau was released in December 1971, shortly before President Nixon's trip to China. Downey was not freed until March 1973, soon after Nixon publicly acknowledged him to be a CIA officer. The Peking announcement in 1954 also revealed that 11 American airmen had been shot down over China in January 1953, while on a mission which had as its purpose the, quote, airdrop of special agents into China and into the Soviet Union. These men were luckier, being freed after only 2.5 years. All told, said the Chinese, they had killed 106 Americans and Taiwanese agents who had parachuted into China between 1951 and 1954 and had captured 124 others. Although the CIA had little, if anything, to show for its commando actions, it reportedly maintained the program until at least 1960. There were many other CIA flights over China for purely espionage purposes, carried out by high-altitude U-2 planes, pilotless drones, and other aircraft. These overflights began around the late 1950s and were not discontinued until 1971, to coincide with Henry Kissinger's first visit to Peking. The operation was not without incident. Several U-2 planes were shot down, and even more of the drones. 19 of the latter, 19 drones, were shot down by, according to the Chinese count, between 1964 and 1969. So they shot down 19 drones in a 5-year period. China registered hundreds of, quote, serious warnings about violations of its airspace. And on at least one occasion, American aircraft crossed the Chinese border and shot down a MiG-17. It would seem that no degree of failure or paucity of results was enough to deter the CIA from seeking new ways to torment the Chinese in the decade following their revolution. Tibet was another case in point. The Peking government claimed Tibet as part of China, as we know, as had previous Chinese governments for more than 2 centuries, although many Tibetans still regarded themselves as autonomous or independent. The United States made its position clear during the war. Quote, the government of the United States has borne in mind the fact that the Chinese government has long claimed suzerainty over Tibet, and the Chinese Constitution lists Tibet among areas constituting the territory of the Republic of China. This government has at no time raised a question regarding either of these claims. So officially, anyway, at that time, after the war, America also recognized Tibet as being a part of China. After the Communist Revolution, Washington officials tended to be more equivocal about the matter. But U.S. actions against Tibet had nothing to do with the niceties of international law. In the mid-1950s, the CIA began to recruit Tibetan refugees and exiles in neighboring countries such as India and Nepal. Amongst their number were members of the Dalai Lama's Guard, often referred to picturesquely as the fearsome Kamba horsemen, and others who had already engaged in some guerrilla activity against Peking rule and or profound social changes being instituted by the revolution. Serfdom and slavery were literally still prevalent in Tibet. Those selected were flown to the United States to an unused military base high in the Colorado mountains, an altitude approximating that of their mountainous homeland. There, hidden away as much as possible from the locals, they were trained in the fine points of paramilitary warfare. After completing training, each group of Tibetans was flown to Taiwan or to another friendly Asian country, thence to be infiltrated back into Tibet or elsewhere in China, where they occupied themselves in activities such as sabotage, mining roads, cutting communication lines, and ambushing small communist forces. Their actions were supported by CIA aircraft and on occasion led by agency contract mercenaries. Extensive support facilities were constructed in northeast India. The operation in Colorado was maintained until sometime in the 1960s. How many hundreds of Tibetans passed through the course of instruction will probably never be known. Even after the formal training programs came to an end, the CIA continued to finance and supply their exotic clients and nurture their hopeless dream of reconquering their homeland. In 1961, when the New York Times got wind of the Colorado operation, it acceded to a Pentagon request to probe no further. This matter was particularly sensitive because the CIA's 1947 charter and Congress's interpretation of that charter had traditionally limited the agency's domestic operations to information collection. In other words, they were in breach of their mandate by training Tibetan paramilitaries inside the United States. But the New York Times, of course, agreed to not report it. Above and beyond the bedevilment of China on its own merits, there was the spillover from the Korean War into Chinese territory. Numerous bombings and strafings by American planes, which the Chinese frequently reported, took civilian lives and destroyed homes. And there was the matter of germ warfare. The Chinese devoted a great deal of effort in publicizing their claim that the United States, particularly during January to March 1952, had dropped quantities of bacteria and bacteria-laden insects over Korea and northeast China. It presented testimony of about 38 captured American airmen who had purportedly flown the planes with the deadly cargo. Many of the men went into voluminous detail about the entire operation, the kinds of bombs and the other containers that were dropped, the types of insects, the diseases that they carried, etc. At the same time, photographs of the alleged germ bombs and insects were published. Then in August, an international scientific committee was appointed, composed of scientists from Sweden, France, Great Britain, Italy, Brazil, and the Soviet Union. After an investigation in China of more than 2 months, the committee produced a report of some 600 pages, many photos, and the conclusion that the people of Korea and China have indeed been the objectives of bacteriological weapons. These have been employed by units of the USA Armed Forces using a great variety of different methods for the purpose, some of which seem to be developments of those applied by the Japanese during the Second World War. The last reference had to do with the bacteriological warfare experiments that the Japanese had carried out against China between 1940 and 1942. The Japanese scientists responsible for this program were captured by the United States in 1945 and given immunity from prosecution in return for providing technical information about the experiments to American scientists from the Army Biological Research Center at Fort Detrick in Maryland. The Chinese were aware of this at the time of the International Scientific Committee's investigation. So I hope you followed that. The Japanese carried out bacteriological attacks against the Chinese during the World War. Those who were responsible for that project were captured by the United States, and the United States gave them immunity from prosecution for war crimes, for crimes against humanity, in return for teach us how to do it. We won't prosecute you for the crimes that we want you to teach us how to do. It should be noted that some of the American airmen's statements contained so much technical biological information and were so full of communist rhetoric, imperialist, capitalist, Wall Street warmonger, for example, and the like, that their personal authorship of the statements must be seriously questioned. Moreover, it was later learned that most of the airmen had confessed only after being subjected to physical abuse. So this is a fair statement by the author, saying that while the Chinese did publish these statements by the airmen, the statements that they made were very likely written by the Chinese themselves, although the fact of the matter was that an investigation was done that showed that this had been done in China and in Korea. And it's also a documented reality that the Japanese perpetrators of the bacteriological warfare were captured by the United States and then employed by the United States. But in view of what we have learned since, learned about American involvement with chemical and biological weapons, the Chinese claims cannot be dismissed out of hand. In 1970, for example, 1970, the New York Times reported that during the Korean War, when U.S. forces were overwhelmed by, quote, human waves of Chinese, the Army dug into captured Nazi chemical warfare documents describing sarin, a nerve gas that's so lethal that a few pounds could kill thousands of people in minutes. By the mid-1950s, the Army was manufacturing thousands of gallons of sarin gas. And during the 1950s and 1960s, the Army and the CIA conducted numerous experiments with biological agents within the United States. To cite just two examples, in 1955, there is compelling evidence that the CIA released whooping cough bacteria into the open air in Florida, followed by an extremely sharp increase in the incidence of that disease in that state in that year. The following year, another toxic substance was disseminated in the streets and tunnels of New York City. We will also see in the chapter on Cuba how the CIA conducted chemical and biological warfare against Fidel Castro's rule. In March 1966, Secretary of State Dean Rusk spoke before a congressional committee about American policy towards China. Mr. Rusk, it seems, was perplexed that, quote, at times the communist Chinese leaders seem to be obsessed with the notion that they're being threatened and encircled. How strange. He spoke of China's, quote, imaginary, almost pathological notion that the United States and other countries around its borders are seeking an opportunity to invade mainland China and destroy the Peking regime. The secretary then added, how much Peking's fear of the United States is genuine and how much is artificially induced for domestic political purposes, only the Chinese communist leaders themselves know. I am convinced, however, that their desire to expel our influence and activity from the Western Pacific and Southeast Asia is not motivated by fears that we are threatening them. And that's the end of chapter 1. So I'll actually end it there. I was hoping I'd be able to finish a full chapter tonight. I'll just say it's very important to read this book or books like this, whether you're American or not American. It's very important to know the history, because when I talk about what they do and when I talk about what they've done, a lot of people maybe don't know the things that America has done, and the fact that they continue to do it, that it's never new. Everything that they're doing is the same. They keep doing the same things over and over and over again because they really are pathological in their approach to the world. They don't know how to approach the world in any other kind of way, because it's just a psychological. You just have to understand the psychology of wanting full and total domination and control. That if you want to have full domination and control, well, no one is going to agree to that. And you know that no one is going to agree to that. So you're always going to take a certain kind of an approach that always has to be hostile, always has to be aggressive, always has to be manipulative and exploitative. And barring that, if you can't do it openly, then you'll do it secretly. And you'll try always to strategize and how you can come at someone, and how you can achieve your domination indirectly if you can't do it directly. So, I mean, everything that we're talking about here with China, America hasn't changed. They continue to operate and behave in the same manner. And so it's very important to understand this history and this documented history of the way America has behaved. And this is just since the World War II, just in the last 70 years or so. And it's kind of important also for the Article 6 campaign, for example, to understand, because these are all crimes that America committed after the establishment of the United Nations. All of these things are reasons why the United States should be expelled from the United Nations. This book in and of itself, particularly because of the time period that it covers, this book in and of itself can be entered as evidence in a case to argue that the United States has persistently violated the principles of the United Nations Charter. Subhanallah. Okay, I'll finish for tonight. Jazakallah khair, everyone, for joining. Inshallah, we'll see you tomorrow. Barakallahu feekum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.